exciting moment, the best moments at the Goa Arts and Literature Festival, very often falsely called disorganized. It's a feature, not a bug. The Goa Arts and Literature Festival has a spontaneous element to it, which is very prized and very special. And there's an element of serendipity to this particular occasion because Jonathan Gale Harris, who's been here before, who's got a wonderful book on the first Firangi. I urge you to look for that book and buy it. It's got an element which has Goa in it. He's got beautiful accounts of Luis Camoish and also Garcia da Horta. It's a wonderful book. But this year he came out with a new book which is called Masala Shakespeare, and it's about how India has adopted and absorbed and perhaps completely transformed Shakespeare. We always were scheduled to have this session with him, but the book was not supposed to be here. We were told that the book would not be ready. But this morning on the lawns, there it was. So a wonderful moment. A big hand for Masala Shakespeare and Jonathan Gale Harris. And for this impromptu moment, we are very honored that Shashi Deshpande will be doing the honors and launching the book as we do. So please join us on stage, Shashi. So the remarkable new book, Masala Shakespeare, which will rethink our understanding of the bard, who the British think belongs to them. Here we are. Congratulations. Thank you so much.
Just today morning when I came and said, would you mind watching this? And I said, Shakespeare. Anything with Shakespeare, because I remember a great writer called me back ghost in somewhere, and I said, I don't mind being a ghost from Shakespeare, anything with him. So congratulations. I look forward very much to reading that book because I've seen a variety of Shakespeare in all the languages.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shashi. Thank you, Vivek. If you played Banquo's Ghost, let me just say I'll be very happy if you shake your gory locks at me. So as befits a presentation on Shakespeare, but also Hindi cinema, there's going to be a lot of movement here today. And not because I'm going to be busting my dance moves, although let's wait and see what happens, but because unfortunately we've got a bit of a technical challenge here. There's a PowerPoint presentation I'm running and I'm going to have to keep darting between the stage and the audience, but that seems actually kind of appropriate for what I'm speaking about, which is about a form of entertainment that keeps crossing boundaries. So, Masala Shakespeare. Here's Shakespeare. There's Shakespeare. Looking a bit dour and grim in this famous portrait from the frontispiece of the first folio. And Bollywood. There seems to be nothing they have in common, right? Look at it closely. Shakespeare, black and white, grim. Bollywood, technicolor, explosive. Just about the only thing they have in common is a predilection for outsized collars. Amitabh Bachchan there, you can see, sporting his 70s look. Shakespeare sporting his 1610 look. But for most of us, the idea that Shakespeare and Bollywood would have much to say to each other is kind of counterintuitive. And the idea that Shakespeare could be in any way Indian seems absolutely absurd. What I'm going to suggest today is that if Shakespeare was alive today, he would not be writing for theatre, he'd be writing for cinema. And he wouldn't be writing for Hollywood, he'd be writing for Bollywood. This isn't just an idle joke. In fact, the biggest screenplay writer in Hindi cinema right now is arguably Shakespeare, or some version of him. So, the fact is, if you say that Shakespeare is a foreigner, you neglect the fact that Shakespeare is everywhere in India. He's as pervasive as the smell of cooking. You go to Calcutta, because of course everything that happens in India happens first in Bengal, or so I'm told. There is an area called Shakespeare Sharani, Shakespeare Street. And it's not just locations, it's also politicians. They cannot stop themselves from channeling Shakespeare. Let me give you an example, in fact 3, across the political spectrum. Pranab Ghai, our former president, when he was finance minister in the UPA, he prepared a budget and he prefaced it by saying, "I have to be cruel to be kind." Playing Hamlet. This is of course a quote from Hamlet. Then that famous Shakespearean critic, Smriti Irani, formerly HRD minister, subsequently Minister of Textiles, rounded on her opponents by telling them that they think fair is foul and foul is fair. I'm not entirely sure that she realized she was channeling the witches from Shakespeare, but that's kind of it. And then, from the other side of the political spectrum, Sitaram Yechuri, talking about problems with the government's sanitation programs. Again, quotes Macbeth, "All the perfumes of Arabia will not remove the stain." So it's not just politicians, it's also authors. Here are just 2 examples. Salman Rushdie's, I think, much overlooked novel, The Moor's Last Sigh, is in many ways an extended conversation with Othello. Anjum Hassan's really interesting book, Neti Neti, is a conversation with Hamlet. And there are many other examples. Shoikat Majumdar's book, The Firebird, involves an extraordinary production of Midsummer Night's Dream set in a seedy Bengali theatre. Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy, one of the most memorable sequences, at least for a Shakespearean like me, is a production of Twelfth Night in the middle of the play, in the middle of the novel. And recently, Preeti Taneja's extraordinary book, We That Are Young, has reworked King Lear in the context of Delhi, Punjab and Kashmir. It's not just Anglophone writing, though, that has adapted Shakespeare. Shakespeare is most present in Hindi cinema, and this just begins to scrape the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. Here are 8 productions from Angur in 1981 to more recent ones that you may be more familiar with. Shakespeare is everywhere in Bollywood. Now, many people would think that Shakespeare's presence owes everything to the colonial period, and in many ways it does. Here is our dear friend Thomas Macaulay in his famous Minute on Education, talking about how not only a single shelf of European literature is worth more than all of the amassed literature of Asia. He is also proposing that for the colonial project to succeed, Indians need to be educated into the literature and culture of England. And that was a project that began in Bengal and continues to this day. But I'd argue that it's not just because of Thomas Macaulay's legacy that Shakespeare has proved so popular. There's another ingredient, and ingredient is the key word here. Masala. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that Shakespeare ground up haldi or jeera in order to sprinkle his concoctions with Indian spices. He does make a reference, of course, to the spiced Indian air in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But I'm talking about something much more fundamental, something that you're all familiar with. It's an idea of masala. Masala is mixture. And this idea is one that has been around for a long time, especially in Indian literature. The great Hindi writer, I might say the great Hindustani writer, Premchand, said that for any piece of fiction to be successful, it needs several ingredients, but the most important is masala. And by that he meant not our modern day usage of sprinkling masala on a story, adding embellishment, exaggeration. He meant mixture. And of course, Premchand embodied mixture at the level of language. We think of him as a Hindi writer, but he wrote so many of his stories in the Nastaliq script. And he translated many of the stories that he'd written in Urdu into Hindi, or more accurately, that blended, mixed language, Hindustani. Now, Premchand's legacy is one that, to a certain extent, we can all relate to in a subcontinent where so many different languages are spoken. And it's not just that we have, as Shashi Deshpande was referring to this morning, individual language states, which has always been something of a fiction. It's that in our everyday conversation, we keep swerving between languages. This is one of the things that I actually find most exhilarating about living in India, is that in the course of everyday conversation, people find that they have to move a thought in a different language from the one they've started. So I found in Delhi, for instance, I've had to completely jettison the Hindi that I was taught by my very well-meaning but slightly batty Hindi teacher in America many years ago. She taught me a version of Hindi that was so Sanskritized that even Doordarshan wouldn't recognize it. And I realized after I came to Delhi, no one would understand if I said, Kripya, mere mitra. Well, there are a few people at Racecourse Road who might encourage that kind of speaking. But speaking with people on the street, speaking with sabziwalas, speaking with taxi drivers, I realized that I had to emulate the way in which they swerved between Hindi, Bhojpuri, Punjabi, Urdu, English. And I think this is something that everyone here can relate to at some level or other. That in your everyday speech, you're not just speaking English, or Konkani, or Hindi, or Marathi. In fact, what you're doing is negotiating between all of these. Masala, right? Now, the Masala movie is very much part of this tradition of swerving. And it's worth noting that this legendary film, Mother India, starring Nargis as Mother India, you'll notice something about the poster. It's not just in English or Hindi, it's also in Urdu, right? And this was standard in Hindi movies for the longest time. Hindi movies were, in fact, this is the big secret of Hindi movies. They were not Hindi movies in the sense of being should. Their language was always moving between Hindi, Urdu, more recently Punjabi as well. But the Masala movie, we may associate it with a certain genre of really bad movie that took off in the 1970s and became really popular in the 80s. We associate it in particular with the name of Manmohan Desai. These horrible escapist movies with villains and heroes with the most vacuous dialogue bazi imaginable and completely random song and dance routines. These films seem to really have nothing to do with the lived experience of being in India. Manmohan Desai said, I want my films to be escapes from the grim reality of India. But I'd argue that the Masala film is in fact something that long predates Manmohan Desai. And it needn't be quite the escapist fantasy that his version of it was. Hindi films, since their inception, have always been multilingual, and that's partly because they've been dealing with mixed audiences. It's easy for us to forget this in the age of the multiplex, and even more in the age of Netflix, where we think of audiences as much more homogeneous, even singular. But in the age of the single-screen cinema, films had to appeal to audiences that spoke many languages, that also came from many classes, many communities. So even if a Hindi film was absolutely daft and stupid in terms of its content, i.e. 90% of them, at the level of its form, in terms of its commitment to mixture, it held up a mirror of some kind to the mixed polity who had come to see the film. This was true not only of the language and of the cinema house in which the film was screened, it was true also of the genre. A Masala film is not a tragedy, but nor is it a comedy. It is a tragedy and a comedy. It's never really set in just one place. It might be set in a gaon somewhere, in Uttar Pradesh, but then for no reason whatsoever, it's suddenly in Switzerland with air blowers making Madhuri's hair billow in the wind. It keeps darting all over the place. And for many of us now, that makes us cringe. And I'd argue that it makes us cringe because we've internalized an imperative towards singularity and purity. And unfortunately, this chimes with certain winds that are blowing in the political sphere as well. This is what I want to suggest. The Masala film, no matter how conservative or regressive its express politics may be, actually proposes or reflects an idea of India that is quite radical, or rather, radical in the literary sense of being foundational, fundamental to an idea of India that's enshrined in the Constitution that I fear we're losing right now in an increasing age of Shurita. So, even modern Masala films, and I think Masala unfortunately is dying out. You'll notice in Netflix productions, Nach Gana has disappeared more or less completely. In film set and release in multiplexes, you'll occasionally have a Nach Gana routine at the very end, but for the most part, music is confined, as it is in Hollywood, to simply being soundtrack. There seems to be an increasing nervousness about Masala as unrealistic, out of date, old-fashioned. But even a fairly recent film like Ye Javani Hai Divani, Hindu characters, but they're lip-syncing to heavily Urdu songs. Re Fakira, yep. You know what I'm talking about. There is a commitment in this film, it's a mixture. Even this opening item number with Madhuri Dixit and Ranbir Kapoor in what is a very sort of stylized kotha that seems to hark back to the Lucknowi culture, even though they're singing about Agra and Delhi. So there's a sense of deep mixture in the DNA of the film, the Masala film, which is unfortunately dying out, I suspect. Now, all of this can describe Shakespeare too. It's easy for us to forget, particularly if we've encountered Shakespeare primarily only in print, that Shakespeare wasn't simply writing to be read. He probably was thinking a little bit of his legacy, but he was writing fundamentally to be performed. And performed to whom? A mixed audience that consisted of very rich people, very poor people, literate people, and illiterate people. And importantly, I'll speak about this more soon, people who spoke very different dialects. There was no such thing as a unified, standardized English language at the time Shakespeare was writing. He had to keep negotiating between different dialects that people from different villages were familiar with, people from different classes were familiar with, people with different educational backgrounds were familiar with. Shakespeare also produced Masala entertainments from a point of view of genre. Although we divide his plays into tragedies and comedies, it's very hard to maintain the purity of that distinction. Tragedies like Hamlet or Othello have clowns in them. Comedies like The Merchant of Venice have profoundly tragic dimensions to them. Shakespeare was writing for a mixed audience. He gave them mixed entertainments in mixed language and mixed genres. Apna Shakespeare, Apna Masala Shakespeare. Now I realized just how much the resonance between Shakespeare and Hindi cinema was quite profound when I first saw Angur, Gulzar's extraordinary adaptation of The Comedy of Errors by Shakespeare. Actually, it's an adaptation of a Bengali film called Granti Bilas. Again, everything is done in Bengal first. Granti Bilas is an adaptation of, a novel adaptation of Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. Now, the amazing thing about Angur is that it is in some ways a very faithful rendition of Shakespeare's comedy that is also a tragedy. Yet it is entirely a Hindi Masala film. Or if not entirely, because it seemed to be pitched at a slightly more upmarket audience than the standard Masala movies of Manmohan Desai and Gulzar's contemporaries there. It still draws on the conventions of the Masala film. There are, for instance, song and dance routines, or song routines, if not dance routines in it. Mixed language, mixed communities. But all these draw on Shakespeare convention as well. By the way, those of you who cringe at Nach Gana and the idea that this could be added to an adaptation of Shakespeare, let me just say, it's not an addition. Shakespeare's plays, when they were first performed in the 1590s, the early 17th century, would always conclude with all the actors getting up and dancing at the end. Even a play like Hamlet, littered with corpses at the end, the corpses would all spring up and dance. This is something that Shakespeare parodies in Midsummer Night's Dream, when Nick Bottom and the various actors within the play, after performing the tragedy of Pyramus and Thisbe to comic effect, spring up and say, "Would you now like us to do a song and dance routine with Bergamask?" Angur, however, was drawing entirely on Hindi film traditions. Angur, like Comedy of Errors, is all about twins who are from different communities, have been separated from each other, are reunited. This is exactly what we find in films like Afsana, what we find in Doom 3, the classic, and even films like Amar Anthony Akbar, three brothers who've been separated from each other. Sorry, I got the order wrong there. Now, the Masala Shakespeare does not date back simply to Gulzar and Angur. It has a long prehistory that we can trace back into the Parsi theatre of the 19th century. And the Parsi theatre was a fascinating attempt to create a professional theatre, one of the earliest professional commercial theatres, in an urban environment, drawing on Indian forms. In particular, Parsi theatre was called Sangeet Natak. That gives you some indication of what it involved. Song and dance, song and play. Many Parsi theatre writers drew on Indian sources, Indian myths and legends, but Shakespeare seems to have been the biggest inspiration for Parsi theatre authors. 75 adaptations that we know of, and probably more, were performed in the 19th into the early 20th century. And when Bollywood was first taking off, amongst the first talkie versions of Hindi films, or Hindustani films, were adaptations of Parsi theatre adaptations of Shakespeare. So for instance, Saurabh Modi, Parsi theatre impresario and director and actor, filmed his Urdu adaptation of Hamlet, Khoon Ka Khoon, Blood for Blood. Interestingly, in the film, which has now disappeared, but we have stills that survive, all the actors wear Elizabethan English costume, but they speak in Urdu, and they sing Urdu songs. A deep commitment to mixture. The film didn't do that well, but it didn't dissuade Saurabh Modi. His next film was called Syed-e-Havas, Lust Story. This is an adaptation of Shakespeare's little-produced play King John. But this kind of set the pattern for a long, long engagement with Shakespeare. This was not simply an adaptation of Shakespeare, it was almost a mutual recognition, like twins coming together in Comedy of Errors and saying, wait a second, we're related. Parsi theatre recognized in Shakespeare something masala about him that we have been taught now to suppress or forget. Now this legacy continues into the present with adaptations of Shakespeare's comedies. Angur I've mentioned, 10 Mil Love, which is a Bombay adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream. Vishal Bhardwaj's famous trilogy of adaptations of Shakespeare's best known tragedies. And I think it was Naseeruddin Shah who said that Bollywood would be impossible without Romeo and Juliet. And I've just put up here 6 recent conversations with Romeo and Juliet, but we can go back to Nargis performing in 1947, interesting year, in a version of Romeo and Juliet that is now lost, with songs written by Faiz Ahmed Faiz. How I wish we had that film. Subsequently, Mughal-e-Azam has elements of Romeo and Juliet in it. Bobby, with a comic ending. We also have Kayamat Se Kayamat Tak, and this recent round of adaptations, conversations, semi-conversations. Amongst these, it's worth noting the Punjabi blockbuster Jat and Juliet, and in typical Punjabi style, it ends happily. Romeo and Juliet migrate to Canada, paving the way for a sequel, Jat and Juliet 2. So I just want to speak very quickly about Romeo and Juliet, and how once we begin to see Shakespeare through the lens of the Masala movie, we we can recognize a lot that was Masala already about Shakespeare. In particular, his use of language. And that's what's often most difficult for us because, let's face it, his language is very foreign to us, even as it is also eerily familiar. But Romeo and Juliet's language is particularly difficult because it's full of puns. And perhaps the most famous pun, many of you probably were taught this at high school if you were taught Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio, Romeo's buddy, has been slain, and he's dying, and he says, "Ask for me tomorrow and you'll find me a grave man," right? Now, it's typical Shakespearean pun, but there is an extra element to it. Puns aren't simply puns. Puns happen in certain contexts. And in particular, cultures where there are multiple languages circulating are more inclined to pun. For, when you think about it, obvious reasons. A word in one language sounds exactly like a word in another language, but has a totally different meaning in the other language. This is true here. Grave comes from the French GALF, meaning serious. Look for me tomorrow and you'll find me a very serious man. But grave also means gravestone, which comes not from French, but from the German graben, which means to dig. And this gives you some indication of how English as a language was drawing from many streams. It's a little bit like English today, mixing up many different tongues. And this is something that we find throughout Romeo and Juliet. I'll whiz through this quickly because I see we're almost out of time. No one remembers the first 4 lines of Romeo and Juliet. These are often excluded from productions, but this is one of the most Indian parts of the play. It starts with 2 men. They are kinsmen of Juliet, the Capulets, and they're talking about how they're going to beat up anyone they see from the rival clan, the Montagues. First 4 lines of the play, we get a flood of puns. Gregory, on my word, will not carry coals. No, for then we should be colliers. I mean, if we be in collar, we'll draw. Gregory, I, while you live, draw your neck out of the collar. Normally when I teach this, most people look at me like this. Why does Shakespeare have to show off like that? This is completely, I hate puns. If you're Indian, you hate puns, you hate the languages you speak. I've never met cultures that are more prone to puns than the ones you find in the subcontinent. It's precisely because of your exposure to many languages. That's what Shakespeare is doing here. Now, this is what all these weird terms mean. Carry coals, put up with insults. Colliers, carriers of coal, and collar, angry, collar, hangman's noose. But what's interesting to me is all these terms come from 4 different languages. Coal comes from German, colliers from French, collar from Latin, collar from Italian. Shakespeare was not just showing off, he was presuming an audience who are used to swerving between different dialects in exactly the same way you do. Now I'm going to close with a sequence from an interesting conversation with Romeo and Juliet, the film Ishikzade, and this is an item number called Jalavala. Now, we are trained to think of item numbers as completely pointless, and they often seem to be visually. At the level of what is happening with language, item numbers are often the most interesting things in films, and I'd even argue the most Shakespearean part of films. Now, this is an item number that happens right at the beginning of the film. And I want you to tell me, this is a Hindi film, what language is the song in? Now, let me just point out that we're not getting the sound on this, are we? Okay, I'm just going to have to sing it to you then. I warned you. Let me just say, you can read the lyrics up here as I talk to you. All the punning that is going on with Samson and Gregory at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet lays the scene for a play that is about love between people from different communities who are not meant to hook up, right? Romeo and Juliet come from different communities, they're not meant to hook up, but they do. In that opening exchange, German, French, Latin, Italian, not meant to hook up. Totally different languages, different linguistic states. Shakespeare makes them hook up as if he's subliminally preparing us for what will happen at the level of love. Language and love are very, very similar in terms of their movements across borders, right? Now, Ashikon ki hai shaman. Ya afakta hai chand baby hai ai kaya matta hai. Now, these are probably the most famous lines coming up now, where the singer, you remember this, the Ashikon, title Titanic. Okay. Now, what interests me about the song, it's not in Hindi, or if it's in Hindi, it's a Hindi that is impure and that keeps crossing boundaries. It moves from Hindi to Urdu to English, even later to Persian to Arabic. And it is full of puns. Titled Titanic, my absolute favorite, we're not going to get to it now, is for teacher and teacher. There's a cross-lingual pun that really produces something absolutely wonderful. Yes, teachers can be for teachers. But the point is here, I think, to recognize that Hindi film has been able to find in Shakespeare something that at least I, growing up in monolingual New Zealand, had never been taught to recognize about Shakespeare. The sheer delight in mixture, the sheer delight in bringing people together from more than one community in a theatre house and saying we can speak to each other, all right? I fear this is what we're losing right now. It's no coincidence the Masala film is dying out. It's no coincidence that we're insisting more and more on the singularity and purity of language. We're purifying Shakespeare as well, making him high, something far, far distant from that shouldn't be contaminated from what makes us cringe, Bollywood films. I hope that after this you will not only want to buy my book, there we go, but you will also recognize what is deeply Shakespearean about Hindi cinema, but also what is deeply Masala about Shakespeare. Thank you very much.